the market for a new small SUV and you've got more money to spend than mainstream, but you don't want to go all the way to luxury, there are mid-premium options on the market, and we've got two of them here to examine today.
Exactly. Our first is the Buick Encore GX, and behind me, the Mazda CX-5. Now, they aren't quite on the same level. One difference between these two is price, and the Buick, as tested, comes in at about $3,600 less than the Mazda. Of course, for that, with the Mazda, you get more features. So we'll be talking about those, but again, you have to take into account the price when you are shopping.
Exactly. Let's get in the cars and take them for a spin, and we'll talk us through it. Starting things off here in the 2024 Buick Encore GX Avenir, and before we start, we're going to get ahead of you guys in the comments saying, why are you comparing an Encore GX with a CX-5? They're not even the same class of vehicle. We know. So the reason we're doing this is because sometimes we're asked to compare vehicles that, even though they might not make sense strictly from an industry perspective, you guys are out there on the internet searching for information on comparing these two vehicles. So that's why we're here looking at these two, because the search engines are telling us you want to know what these two vehicles compare like, so here we are.
Now, as far as pricing goes, the Mazda CX-5 starts at $32,250, and for that you get a non-turbo 2.5-liter i4. We are going to be driving the Suna, which is one below the top signature. It comes with the turbocharged engine, and as tested, we're looking at $44,200. Now, this Buick GX that we're in, it starts at $29,649 in front-wheel drive. The Mazda only comes in all-wheel. To start off in all-wheel with the Buick, you're looking at $31,649. We are in the top-line Avenir, and that is $36,579. So we're looking at about a $3,600 difference. Not only is that in the engine, but it's in a lot of the items as well. Some of them are optional on the Buick, whereas they're standard on the Mazda. And in some cases, the Mazda has items that the Buick doesn't have at all. Engine-wise, and I've got my notes here, so we know this is accurate. If we had the Mazda with the plain 2.5, you'd be looking at 187 horsepower, 185 foot-pounds of torque. With the turbocharged engine that we will be driving a little later here, 227 horsepower and 310 foot-pounds of torque. Our Buick that we're sitting in right now, it's a 1.3-liter turbocharged 3-cylinder, and it is giving us 155 horsepower and 174 foot-pounds of torque. So the Buick is at a disadvantage as far as the power goes. But one thing that you and I both said we liked is that the Mazda comes with a 6-speed automatic, and the Buick has a 9-speed automatic. And you said that's smoother, isn't it?
It is, and it really helps to get this engine going even more enthusiastically than the turbo would on its own. So although it is underpowered compared to the two Mazda offerings, it's still an energetic feeling power plant for this size of vehicle.
And I agree with you. I think that it's peppier. It doesn't feel like a 1.3.
No.
And even on the highway, okay, when we're driving along and you've got to do some passing on the highway, you got to be smart about what you're doing. Mm-hmm. But it still gets you where you got to go, and it, like you say, it's not as anemic as those numbers would make it sound.
It's not, and when we're talking about comparing price and directly cross-shopping these two vehicles, it's not as far off from the Mazda base engine as you'd think, and the Mazda base engine brings it a lot closer in price to this vehicle, so that's worth considering.
Exactly. I mean, if we look at some of the differences in that price, they both have 19-inch wheels. The Buick has a larger cluster display, and it has a larger infotainment screen, only by ½ an inch, but still. The sunroof is an option on this Buick. It's included in the Mazda. As we were saying earlier, I kind of like that because I'm one of the few people that doesn't like sunroofs. So, you know, that's an option to look at. The Mazda does have ventilated seats and heated rear seats that you're not getting on here. It has a head-up display. The Buick has a remote starter. A lot of people like that. Mm-hmm. They both have memory, and the Buick has a fold-flat passenger seat. And you were saying that you brought home some pretty long stuff in it.
I had an 8-foot piece of baseboard in this little tiny Encore GX, so it's impressive the length of items that you can get in here. In the cargo space in the back, though, it's not quite as roomy as the Mazda.
No, it isn't. And one thing to point out, an 8-foot length of baseboard, you won't get that into the back of a crew cab pickup truck.
That's true.
As far as that cargo compartment goes, in the Buick that we're in right now, we have 665 liters of cargo volume. In the CX-5, that's 871. And if you're carrying a lot of stuff, that can make a difference.
Especially if you're talking about a family of 4. A lot of what we hear of people who are considering subcompact crossovers, SUVs, is that it's families of 4 looking for an affordable option. Some of them end up regretting that decision because by the time you get 2 adults, 2 kids, and enough bags into this vehicle for a hockey game or an overnight or a weekend, you're really getting very tight on space. The CX-5, although its dimensions are slightly smaller than the CX-50, which it directly sits beside it in the Mazda lineup, you do get still a considerable amount of space for the size of the vehicle because these 2 vehicles aren't as different in exterior dimensions as you'd think.
True. The headroom is about the same. It's slightly more in the Mazda, but one thing I find is maybe it's just me, I find the Mazda a little tighter when I'm sitting in the front seats. I find this to be just a little more spacious, but in the rear, absolutely, the Buick is tight. Okay, now we're on a bumpy stretch of road here. What do you find about the suspension?
It is a pretty crashy one and not very refined. I think that compared to the Mazda especially, you are giving up some ride comfort by choosing the Buick here.
And one thing I've noticed, obviously you don't want the floaty feeling that you used to get with older Buicks, but somewhere in the middle would be very nice. The one thing about this I find is it does not feel like a Buick. Not for the ride. It's very noisy, it's bumpy, it's just not what I think of when I think of Buick. Opinions may differ on this. The Buick is all-wheel drive, but it's selectable. And you either put it in front-wheel drive or you press a button and that gives you all-wheel. It's a system that still stays in front-wheel drive under most driving conditions, but when needed, if for extra traction, it will pull in the back wheels and give them power to help you along. What I don't understand is why it is selectable, because the fuel difference is absolutely minimal. And if you don't think to put it into all-wheel drive, then you could be driving along, all of a sudden you hit nasty weather like we have here, and it's not there for you to use. The benefit, of course, is that once you turn the all-wheel drive on, it stays on, even after you shut the car off and then start it again. So there is that advantage to it. I'm just not seeing why you would even have the selectability at the onset. There's the possibility of forgetting to turn it on.
I think some people really like to have the choice because they're old school drivers and they prefer to be able to make that level of selection in their vehicles. The average driver in this day and age doesn't want that level of involvement in driving their car, and they'll probably just leave it on most of the time, maybe at a slight expense of fuel economy, but it's not going to make that much of a difference to most people. The people who want it, it's there. If you don't, just leave it parked in all-wheel drive and you'll be fine. Now,
another thing to talk about are the infotainment systems, and they're completely different in how you operate them. The Buick has a touch screen. It's a touch screen all the time. It's relatively simple to operate. All of the icons are large. It's easy to figure out. There's a dial for the volume. The Mazda, on the other hand, has a controller, and it sits in the console. Everything you do in the screen has to be done through that controller. It's not a touch screen, at least not when you're using that. So you have to hit buttons, you have to spin around. One thing I found that's really annoying is if the voice-controlled navigation can't find the address that you're trying to put in, you have to put it in manually, and that involves going around a whole circle and dialing in one letter, one number at a time. What's really odd is that you've got your iPhone hooked up to this because Apple CarPlay and Android Auto are part of the system in the Mazda, and it's easy to do, it's wireless. But as soon as you do that, it becomes a touch screen.
Yeah.
And you can work everything off your phone by touch on the screen. So why can't we do that with the regular system?
It's bizarre, and I respect Mazda for holding so fast to their conviction that it's not safe to be operating a touchscreen while you're driving. But if you're going to stick to that conviction and continue to use the rotary dial, then you can't really put in the option of CarPlay and say everything's okay. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think it's time for Mazda to accept that most people want touchscreens in their cars and focus more on making sure that it's very usable and in a good position. One thing I do like about Mazda's screen is it's as close as possible to your field of vision with the road, and so you don't have to pull your eyes very far off the road to see what you're doing on the screen. The Buick is a little further down, not as far down as some of these ridiculous portrait style screens that we see in vehicles these days, but you're still taking your eyes further off the road to use it, and that is as much of a safety issue. In my opinion, Mazda does do that well.
Exactly. One thing with the Buick is we do not have embedded navigation in it. The Mazda that we have tested does have that. And as you pointed out, yes, a lot of people use their phone for that, but not everyone does. It chews up your data. And a lot of people just, they're not comfortable with, you know, always having the phone there. I think for a typical Buick shopper, for the Avenir, the top of the line, to not have a navigation system in it, that does seem a little odd.
I agree with that.
When I'm looking at the interior here in the Buick, it's not bad, but there's an awful lot of hard plastic, and I think that the Mazda has a better looking interior. There is the single screen from the instrument cluster right over to the infotainment system. It's actually not a complete screen all the way through. It's two screens inside this. It still looks pretty impressive, and General Motors is going with a lot of this in the upper levels, some of which are completely screen all the way across, some of which are two separate ones as we have here.
That seems to be the trend across the industry, and that does sort of trap designers into putting that screen at the same level where the instrument cluster needs to be, coming back to that point about how far the screen is going to be away from your field of vision with the road. Mazda has kept them separate up until this point, and again, sticking with their convictions that we're going to set things up for safety and not for aesthetics. I think that makes a lot of sense. It'll be interesting to see as Mazda redesigns come in the next few years where they decide to go with that, but for now you do have two completely separate systems and functions for those two screens.
Correct, and as it is higher, your eyes are looking out more towards what's in front of you. Your attention should never be focused entirely on the screen, but at least you've got your peripheral vision to give you an idea of what's up front. And speaking of what's up front, both of these do have a number of safety features, including emergency front braking, blind spot monitoring, lane keep assist, adaptive cruise control, although the adaptive cruise is an option on the Buick. And one thing that the Mazda has that is not available on the Buick is emergency rear braking as well. So if you're backing up and there's somebody walking behind you and you're not aware of it, it will hit the brakes. And of course, both of them have a rear view camera, which is mandatory on all new vehicles now. And on the Buick, it's a bird's eye camera, which is very handy for when you're backing up so that nobody is behind you when you have to brake.
Maybe not as necessary as in something as big as, say, a Chevy Tahoe, but still helpful in tight parking lots and that sort of thing.
Oh, absolutely, because you can see down the side and you can see exactly where your parking lines are. And as far as fuel economy goes, well, they're actually pretty close, as tested by Natural Resources Canada, and we're going by the official ratings. Our Mazda will get 9.3 liters to 100. Our Encore GX does a little bit better at 8.8. As we both noticed in the Buick, it gets much better mileage on the highway. And now all cars do, but we're finding that the Buick is coming considerably closer to those numbers. For a city car, it likes being on the highway.
It sure does. Yeah, my city numbers, spending all my time on city roads, I was cresting 10 liters per 100 kilometers, which is a lot for a vehicle of this size.
Exactly, and I spent more of my time on the highway, and I was getting much closer to the NRCan numbers. So this little 1.3, even with the 9-speed automatic transmission, it's still got to work a bit to get everything moving. So now that we've seen what Buick has to offer, let's get in the Mazda and see what it's all about.
Great.
Now here we are in the Mazda CX-5, and before we do anything, let's talk about keys.
Let's talk about it.
This is just a minor thing, but still, this is the Mazda key. And as you can see, it's just all these little tiny buttons, and they're hard to see. I'm even holding it upside down. Whereas you look at the Buick key, and it's big buttons on the front. And as we were saying earlier, when you've got something like this and you're walking towards the car in a parking lot at night, I'd rather have this big button here than these little ones here. Minor thing, but
completely agree. So if you're walking up to the car, you can get to the car and hit the button to get in, and you're still going to get in keyless. But, you know, maybe somebody's going ahead of you and you want to unlock the car for them, and then you're fumbling looking for the tiny little buttons. Usability over fashion.
Exactly. And as you can see, I mean, there's even more space to put buttons on here, and they're just there.
That's right.
Again, minor, but
it makes a difference.
We are the ones that point out the stuff we find.
That's right.
Now, we've both been driving these cars all week, and tell me, what do you think about the Mazda as far as handling and performance goes?
Well, as we pull out of the parking lot and get this up to speed, right away you can feel the difference in the ride quality, coming back to what we started talking about in the Buick. There's not that crashy sort of feeling like a plank of plywood on wheels like the Buick does, frankly. There's more play to this, but it's still got that signature Mazda stiffness to it that's more, you feel that it's more for better handling and performance than for a lack of refinement. This is a very refined and well-driving vehicle.
So one of the things I do find is the steering is a little heavier, but it's not heavy. It just feels a little more confident. It feels like it's responding better. It's not as light as the Buick. Some people do like light steering, but I find overall the performance and the steering feel and just the general ride is better than the Buick.
Fully agree. Mazda built its name on the quality of handling and drive performance in its vehicles, and it shows even here in the CX-5, a vehicle that is not new by any stretch. It's a few years old. The CX-50 has come in to, in theory, replace the CX-5 over the course of years, and yet this remains a good vehicle and a great choice for a lot of households.
It does, and I like the interior. It's got like a stitch. There's more soft touch stitching on the dash, a little bit of what might even look like fake carbon fiber. It looks the price. Mm-hmm. And yes, it is pricier than the Buick, but there's no reason why something can't look good even if it's not as expensive.
And given that we're not in the top trim here, because there is a level above this, the Signature, where some of the finishes get even more upscale than this, I think that Mazda struck a really nice balance with the Suna trim in feature packaging and interior finishes versus what you're paying. You can get the Signature if you want to go all out, but this is a really nice middle ground.
I think so. And part of the Suna is that exterior color. And I think it's a fabulous color. I had another Mazda that was painted this, and I met someone in a parking lot that I had seen a week before, and he remembered me. You had that Mazda that had the great color. And this is a stranger.
That's hilarious.
That's hilarious.
Mazda's great for unique colors, the polymetal gray and the...
Mazda has the best red in the industry.
Yes.
No question.
I was trying to think of it. Soul red.
Soul red.
Yes.
And you also get a head-up display in the Mazda, which I like that because you're not constantly looking down at the instrument cluster, you're looking ahead. I just find it's one of those things that if you don't have it, you can live without it, but if you do get one, you really like it. One thing I do find, and it's probably just me, I just feel like the front seats are a little tighter, a little closer together than in the Buick, even though the numbers bear out that it has more headroom, it has more rear seat legroom. I still find that this is a little tighter. I don't know why. Maybe it's the fact that it's got a wider console. I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's nothing logically that would make sense for it to feel tighter, but I follow you on where that sense is coming from of not having quite as much lateral space. It's maybe something to do with the seats.
It does point out the importance of a lengthy test drive whenever you are shopping for a vehicle, because as you mentioned, we both have partners who have different ride heights as far as the seat goes, different leg lengths, and something that is comfortable even for you between the two of us. We have moved the seat when we have been back and forth in these cars. So everyone is different, and way back in the day, I worked at a car dealership, and I noticed that most people, the test drive was about 5 to 10 minutes.
That's not nearly long enough to figure out what you need to know.
No, and one thing you need to do, and people don't because they think they'll look silly, but you've got to take your dog crate, your stroller, your child seat, your hockey bag, your golf clubs or whatever, and see if they're going to fit, because you don't want to find that out after you've signed on the dotted line and the car is yours.
That's right, because you've lost however many thousands of dollars as soon as you drive that car off the lot, whether your bags fit or not.
Exactly. And yeah, you're going to look silly putting your dog crate in the back, but you've got to do what you've got to do to know if the vehicle is right for you. And so that does involve sitting in all the seats and taking extended drives in it.
Okay, we've talked through these two vehicles. Let's step outside and give a verdict.
Well, let's figure out which one's the winner.
So to sum this all up, what we're ultimately saying is we feel that the Mazda CX-5 is the better vehicle between these two, but with the caveat that these vehicles have different purposes.
And also the price difference. So not only do you get different features in them, but you are also paying less for the Buick. Now that is one thing to understand. If you have the money and you really want to move up, the Mazda is an excellent choice. But again, the Buick, there's an audience for it, there are buyers for it, and really, with anything, you have to cross-shop and find the vehicle that's exactly right for you. So that's our wrap-up of these two vehicles. For Driving.ca, I'm Jill McIntosh.
And I'm Stephanie Wallcraft. For more comparison tests and other features, find us at Driving.ca or on social media.